I think this might be the most stereotypical version of ENFPs. This is the one we usually associate with ENFP types.
These are vomiting rainbows on all the INTJs in their life. Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So on this week's show, we're talking about ENFPs and careers. I like this type. This is my favorite personality type, Antonia.
That's appropriate. You're allowed to have type patriotism.
Is that true?
Isabel Briggs-Myers mentions that in Gifts Differing. She said it's okay to have some type patriotism.
Well, as we talk about ENFP careers today, I mean, you might be an ENFP listening and you might be all over the place in your life, career-wise, or you might have a career that's dialed in for you. We're going to talk about why that might be the case, one of those two extremes or anywhere in between. This came about during our personality life path mentorship. The reason we're having this episode right now is we're doing a series because during our mentorship, which the personality life path, we take 8 weeks, and each week we work with a group of students and we look at each of the cognitive functions, the Jungian cognitive functions, the archetypical energy it represents in the world, and then the attunement of a person's personality type to that function. We give exercises each week for people to go out and test. They go and see how this function and the energy of this function shows up in their life based on their personality and the people around them. And we walk through all 8 functions over those weeks. We culminate in a live event at the end of it where people can hook this together, making their life plan, their life path. In the middle of that, we noticed that a lot of people are in the middle of transition taking this course, taking this mentorship with us. Relationships transitions. People are reevaluating that, or lifestyle transitions. But man, a big one, Antonia, especially during this season of PLP, has been career transitions. People are saying, I don't know if I'm on the right career track. I've been doing something for a while. A few people are starting out fresh. You know, they're out of college. They're starting out in their careers. So we thought this would be a good time to start talking about careers in each of the 16 Myers-Briggs personality types and give some fidelity on how maybe you, if you're an ENFP listening right now, could think about your career path. Think about if maybe you're in a transition moment in your life. How can this be helpful to you? And so we've brought a concept in here called subtypes that we're going to address today, and we'll go into this in just a moment.
Yeah. So, you mean now? Just
well,
a moment.
We're going
right
to go
now?
into break down the subtypes in a moment.
Yeah.
Maybe you could briefly talk about subtypes.
Right. So the concept comes from our good friend, Dr. Dario Nardi, who, as he was observing the same personality type using EEG machine technology, that the brain wiring of each of the types followed a consistent pattern, but it wasn't always the same within a type.
Yeah.
And he noticed that the same style of brain wiring was showing up over and over again throughout all of the types in a consistent way. So the pattern ended up being that there are 4 different ways that we can be wired within a single type. And that created this concept of subtypes, which, as you mentioned, we'll be touching on when it comes to careers. And the reason why there's a relationship between these two things is after the age of 25, the number one factor that influences which subtype that we fall in is our career choice.
Yeah.
Meaning that these subtypes are more the nurture aspect of type. It seems that our personality type is pre-wired in us. It feels more that that's nature. But these subtypes, the way that our type manifests through this brain wiring, that's more influenced by outside factors. So when you choose a career, you're not just choosing what you're going to be spending your time doing. You're also choosing something that's going to be a major influence on how your mind is wired. And so it's relevant. There's a strong relationship between the two.
Yeah, the way I like to think of it is ENFP is the song written on the musical sheet. These 4 subtypes are the performance of that song, right? They're the way you express your ENFP nature. So we'll get into the specifics of that in a moment. I have a top 10 list, though, that I gathered from the internets talking about ENFP career. This is the top 10 list. Again, according to the internet. This isn't super deep research.
Actually, they're usually pretty good, if not a bit stereotypical.
This is what the ENFP careers top 10 list is, according to the internet. Number 1, writer, journalist. Number 2, actor or actress. 3, public relations specialist. 4, career counselor, psychologist. 5, advertising executive. 6, human resources specialist. 7, marketing specialist. 8, event planner. 9, social worker. And 10, entrepreneur or small business owner. Now, as an ENFP, I think I do like at least 4 of these right now as a career overlapping.
Yeah.
And I've done many of them in that list. Maybe you identify yourself in that list as an ENFP.
Yeah, it's a solid list as they usually are, but some of those careers are going to attract certain subtypes more than others. And there are some that are not on that list that would attract certain subtypes of ENFPs that these kinds of ENFPs might never run into a list like that, or the thing that they're supposed to be doing in the world. They might not ever run into it on a list of top 10 ENFP careers because it's a little bit more niched to their subtype preferences.
Yeah. So as we talk about this, let's just list out the 4 subtypes that we're going to talk about today. And we'll talk about why they've clustered this way. The 4 subtypes for the ENFP personality are the dominant ENFP, the creative ENFP, the normalizing ENFP. Ooh, that word normalizing is hard for me to hear. And the harmonizing ENFP. Now, this comes from a few different places. This is based mostly on the work of Dr. Dario Nardi, a friend of ours, a colleague of ours. He's been on the show. We've done a broad podcast about this concept in general. Now we're applying it to each type, but we did it in a general conversation. You want to go back a few episodes right before this series started. We had him here in the studio, and we talked to Dr. Nardi about his concept, and he borrows some from the work of Helen Fisher with neurotransmitters. The names you might be familiar with if you are familiar with socionics and Victor Glenko. He used the names with permission from Dr. Victor Glenko and came up with this subtype concept. And we'll talk about it in both accessibility for you if you're kind of a new person starting out in type, but we'll also go deeper into the neurotransmitters and a little bit into the difference between holistic and analytic functions. We'll talk about that in a moment. Anything else you want to frame before we jump in, or do you want to just jump into one and we'll unpack it as we go?
Well, I do want to say one thing.
Let's do it.
Yeah, you shouldn't bias the normalizing type. Nobody's going to want to think they're a normalizing type if you've got a bias against it.
All right, I'll try my best.
Well, and what's
You'll
funny...
see why I've got a bias against it in a minute.
Yeah, what's funny is that, and before we get into it, you identify as a creative subtype.
Yeah.
And creatives and normalizings are polar opposite of each other.
Oil and water, right?
Yeah, exactly. Just like the dominants and the harmonizings are polar opposites, although they have a tendency to... They're an opposites attract situation, whereas creative and normalizing, they're, like you said, they're oil and water. But don't necessarily turn anybody off or bias them against it because, well, first of all, normalizing ENFPs are awesome, number one.
Yeah.
And number two, it's a perfectly valid way of being, Joel. It's totally valid.
You make good points.
All right.
All right, let's jump in. So let's talk about dominant first. The dominant ENFP subtype. Okay. What are we talking about when we talk about this person?
So dominant ENFPs are kind of what you expect from the word dominant. They're confident, entertaining, they're relatively quick decision makers. I don't know if ENFPs ever think of themselves as super quick, but they're relatively quick. They're good managers and leaders. They tend to seek out, rope in, and direct others with high potential to bring about memorable, compelling results. And of course, this is a lot of the information we're getting is sourced by Dario. And they have a more of an in-charge way of looking at things if you're familiar with Linda Barron's interaction styles. They tend to have good executive skills. They're talkative. They follow lines of reasoning and metaphors really well. They are moderately perceptive, but they're actually a little less perceptive than their other 3 subtypes. So they're still relatively perceptive because they're ENFPs, but this is going to be the less perceptive of the 4. And one of the reasons why is because they're in charge, right? They're a little bit more moving things forward and getting things going and making it so that they're directing traffic as opposed to leaning back and observing. They can juggle the needs of a situation or a context with their own values, likes, and dislikes. And that keeps them moving without being personally offensive to themselves. And they tend to be well-rounded. They're more of a jack of all trades than they are specialists. And they also are a little less havoc-wreaking. They're not the ones who try to break frames. They're trying to reframe situations. So they're a little less poking the bear.
Yeah. So this is the ENFP then, a lot of ENFP ethos is damn the man. Mm-hmm. This is the most man of the ENFPs.
Yeah, this is the man.
Right? This is the person that's going to want to set up this framework, be in charge, have the system running, everybody help support the system, get going.
Yeah, exactly. They have not quite as strong, if you've heard us talk about these types or the subtypes in other of the career podcasts, sometimes I mention this concept of a starburst pattern, which is almost like the brainstorming phenomena that happens when you're watching a brain go into brainstorming.
Yeah.
That starburst pattern is not as strong for this ENFP as it is for some of the other ENFPs. They do it just enough to solve problems, actually. And so they're not going to be as insistent on doing creative brainstorming work as other ENFPs are, mostly because they're looking for solutions. They're a little bit more results oriented. They can easily follow styles and templates, but they improvise when they do so, trying to get the most out of potential. They're quick to try things out, especially in those executive roles. So if they are in a management position, they're not going to be your standard manager. They're going to be ones that are taking more risks, basically. Yeah. And of course, they trust their intuition, just like all ENFPs do. They themselves they're not just dominant ENFPs, they can dominate the scene. All right. So they're like a force to be reckoned with, basically. And when they do that, they tend to be very talkative, right? Their energy sort of follows them into a room. And that's one of the reasons why they're a little less perceptive, because they can miss details as their sort of energy is in front of them. They can sometimes come across a little egotistical. They can come across maybe not as smart or ethical as they think they are, in part because of that, that willingness to sort of leap, that willingness to take charge. Yeah. And so sometimes it's good for a dominant ENFP to learn some of those receptive skills, right? So that they can come across the way that they want to come across. And they are incredibly persistent with an ability to bring excitement to everything. And so they can get people on board, mobilized, herd cats, right? They can get them going a direction that holds a real vision. Yeah. And so they're exciting people. And they tend to be the ENFPs that are the most conventionally rewarded, meaning that they tend to find success, right? They're that force to be reckoned with, and they usually can capitalize on that. A big sign of their character is if they're willing to share praise. Right. So if they do something big and other people have helped them and they're willing to, sort of spread the credit around, it's a sign of character.
Yeah. So I definitely, when we talk about creative, will identify a lot with the creative. But I think there's moments, and then we're going to talk about this too, just because you're an ENFP and you maybe identify with one of these doesn't mean you can't lean into others. I think I lean into this one personally, particularly when we're running live events or hosting workshops or mentorships, when I have to show up to lead as an ENFP. It feels like this part of me gets activated. It's very much like a dominant kind of let's go this direction energy that I move into, and hopefully people rest into that and I can move the ball forward for folks.
I think this is actually more natural for you. I think this is the one that you probably would have landed on had your upbringing not encouraged you to go more creative.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons being, and as we mentioned, Joel mentioned before, that we're going to try to keep this accessible to people who are new to type, but we also will throw a little bit of tech jargon in for the geeks, right? Yeah. The Myers-Briggs geeks. So what makes a dominant, creative, normalizing, harmonizing subtype is how you're using your first two preferred functions. So for ENFPs, that's extroverted intuition. We call it exploration as a dominant or driver. And introverted feeling, or what we call authenticity, as a co-pilot or auxiliary function.
And this is how you learn information using your driver or that exploration process, and you make decisions with authenticity.
Right, exactly. So each of the cognitive functions can be used in a more focused way or in a more diffused way. So that focused way is a more assertive energy that tends to push out. And the diffused way is a more sort of open to seeing the peripherals as opposed to being hyper-focused on a single point. And depending upon how you prefer to use these functions, whether or not you really like to use them in that more assertive energy-focused way or in a more relaxed, diffused, open to the peripheral way, that's what creates your subtype. And for dominant ENFPs, both of their functions, they prefer an analytic or that hyper-focused bent. So the dominant type, both their functions, like their preferred functions, are very assertive. It's an energy that's focused, going out, tends to be very certain, right?
Yeah.
And so that's what creates that dominant energy.
And then from a neurotransmitter standpoint, we talked about that. The preferred chemical is testosterone. This subtype's going to have that as their neurotransmitter preference.
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
All right, so you want me to get into the careers?
Let's go over to careers of the dominant, yes. And then we'll jump into creative after that.
So careers that might suit a dominant ENFP. Now remember, this is not a comprehensive list. It's just like the kinds of things. It should give you an idea of what would suit this style of ENFP. Marketing director, human resources manager, public relations manager, business consultant, project manager, sales manager, lots of managers, event planner, entrepreneur, talent agent, corporate trainer, nonprofit director, advertising executive, motivational speaker, life coach, or television or film producer. So all of these capitalize on that confident, entertaining, quick decision-making that allow them to direct and manage other people. So it's that more assertive energy.
Let's talk about mistypes though, because I'm expecting this type, especially because it plays so nice in systems, hierarchical systems. My guess is this might be mistyped for ENTJ, possibly ESTJ, like an EJ, ETJ energy, right?
Yeah, or just a judger energy, right? Like they might also, if a person isn't familiar with cognitive functions and how they work, they might think that they have ENFJ preferences, like you said, ENTJ or even ESTJ preferences. Yeah. And, but there's that improvisational aspect. And the list that I just mentioned also, provides opportunities for problem solving, improvisation, that kind of stuff. And so that will always be a part of an ENFP, even if they are in this more dominant sort of energetic space.
Of course. Okay. Let's talk about the creative subtype of ENFP. So these are creative ENFPs.
I think this might be the most stereotypical version of ENFPs. This is the one we usually associate with ENFP types.
These are vomiting rainbows on all the INTJs in their life.
I mean, maybe. Now, you remember the vomiting rainbows are other people's type, right? Sort of projection onto ENFPs. I don't think any ENFP themselves actually sees themselves that way. And I sometimes wonder if it gets mixed up with a little ESFP in there too. Creative ENFPs are notably outgoing, positive, adaptable, energetic, welcoming. They're cheerful. They tend to be able to both perceive and entertain all at once. So unlike the dominant ENFP that tends to miss things because they're so assertive, this is a style that can both perceive and take things in while at the same time entertaining others. And it's probably because they don't have the heavy lift of having to manage or be a leader, right? They can just be entertaining and it's okay.
Yeah.
They tend to be wanderers, exploring all that life has to offer. And they're a little bit more of that stir the pot, right? The dominant ENFP respects the structure a little bit more. The creative is the one that pokes the beehive. They have a strong starburst pattern. So they're definitely going to be the brainstorming kind of ENFP, and not just for solutions, for anything. Every input is like a potential secret letter that everyone must see. That's something that Dario said about them, and I thought that was fantastic. Their brains are very active. They are very likely to trust their talent to adapt, noticing ideal moments to move, and finding ways to use their skills. So it's very much about optimizing their own movements, optimizing how they can bring what they have to offer to the situation. And they can handle a lot of complexity. So they do this brainstorming, playing with possibilities until somebody else helps them ground it. So unlike the dominant ENFP that is a little bit more self-grounding, this is a style that really needs other people to help ground them. So they have really good, remarkable rapport building skills, right? So I would say probably remarkable is a better word than really good. They're very good at rapport building. They make quick, uncanny insights into voice tone and body language. So they're very in touch with reading the other person's responses to them. They have fair executive skills, so not as good as the dominant ENFP. If the situation or task is very clear and simple and direct, then they're fine. If it is complex, challenging, multi-layered, like Gantt chart style, right? That might be a little bit more difficult, and they might have trouble focusing and making decisions in a situation like that. Overall, they're social and artistic, And those have a tendency to be the most interesting things to them, anything that has a social bent or an artistic bent. And even when they're doing things that aren't particularly social or artistic, right?
Yeah.
They're going to bring that into every situation. So they're going to turn everything into that effectively, which is a part of what makes them so creative. They usually pursue multiple careers, sometimes moving back and forth between them and sometimes doing them simultaneously. You mentioned, I think I do 4 things on that list already. And it's a merging of all of these different interests and careers into one thing. And if a creative ENFP can get away with that, they certainly will. And they usually look pretty gifted. They usually look like they're really good at whatever it is that they're doing. But they aren't as self-motivated as the dominant.
Yeah.
So they can motivate themselves in spurts. They can do it a little at a time, or they have to set up a situation that really they find compelling and motivating. It's a little harder for them to push themselves as hard as the dominant.
They need inspiration to be motivated.
Yep, exactly. As I mentioned before, they have a rebellious streak. All right, so this is the one that tends to poke the bear. And they're just quirky in general, right? They're energetic and quirky as partners, as parents, as colleagues. They're just they're interesting, goofy people. And because of that, they really benefit from having other people in their lives that really ground them.
Okay. So this also, from a technical standpoint, we'll talk about that in a second, but this subtype definitely resonates with me as a creative ENFP. But I've noticed that I go between the dominant and the creative, and it's a war with myself in that poking all the holes and destroying systems. The one part of me in a more dominant way wants to preserve all that and make it all work well. And the other part of me wants to rebel against it and destroy it and sabotage it. It's interesting to see, I bet you listening along as an ENFP, if you identify with one or more than one of these subtypes, you're probably seeing somewhat of a war within yourself between these parts of you, which would be very indicative of an ENFP, kind of different parts of yourself, bringing those into alignment. That's the work of your lifetime, quite frankly.
It's really interesting to watch as a spectator too, Joel.
I'm sure. So let's talk a little bit about the technical aspects. These functions, the driver dominant function of extroverted intuition, we've called it exploration, and the co-pilot of authenticity, technically called introverted feeling, the way the decisions are made for the ENFP. How are these two functions attuned for the creative subtype?
So the first function, extroverted intuition or exploration, that stays analytic. So that still has that focused orientation. That still has that more assertive drive. That's where you get the brainstorming piece. But as opposed to being paired with another, more assertive energy, introverted feeling or authenticity is the one that's a little bit more relaxed. It's a little more open, holistic. It's not as certain. It doesn't have as much of a drive to make things happen. It's a little bit more flexible.
Yeah.
So.
So one of the things as we talk about the careers here in a moment, by the way, the neurotransmitter preference is dopamine. That's what the ENFP that's creative is seeking out, is that chemical. Platforms are very important for this subtype. Platform thinking. When I say platform thinking, what I mean is something like YouTube is a platform. If you're a creative person and you create videos or music and you're on SoundCloud or YouTube, these are platforms that can help you get your work out there. Same thing with Etsy. Maybe Uber, it could be considered a platform for being a driver. These are facilitating creative subtypes like the creative ENFP to do work, and that they don't have to build all the structure, all the support. They can plug themselves into some platform that can put them forward and allow them to express themselves as a creative subtype. So let's talk a little bit about some of the career choices for this subtype.
All right. I think some of these really capitalize on what you're talking about as platforms. Basically anything that grounds you, right?
Yeah.
Something that does some of the heavy lifting on that.
Supports you, really.
Right. Yeah, not just grounds, but supports. So the list of, again, this is not comprehensive, but this should give you an idea of the kinds of things that really appeal to the creative types. We've got travel blogger, art therapist, social media influencer, actor, graphic designer, freelance writer, event coordinator, motivational speaker, made it again, art director, photographer, musician, community outreach coordinator, personal trainer, interior design, and tour guide. So this is a list of careers that sort of emphasize that more outgoing, positive, adaptable component of this style of ENFP. It also allows them to stay energetic. All of these would require high energy.
Yeah.
And it also allows them to challenge norms, right? And get outside of, what's expected. So these are all careers that allow a person to constantly evolve, constantly change and output and do things a little bit differently. And they're also quite social. So that piece of not only the art, but the social aspect gets woven into all of these.
Yeah. And that platform can take care of all the nitty gritty detail stuff, you know, all the financials and all the scheduling and all that thing. So you, as a creative ENFP, can focus on what you do well, which is bring your creativity and art and performance and expression to the world.
Yeah, and none of them will really, if you maintain that rebellious streak, it won't be too damaging to your career path.
Yeah. Let's talk about the normalizing ENFP. What does this subtype look like?
So this is the exact opposite of the creative. And by that, I mean, if you look at those two cognitive functions, extroverted intuition, introverted feeling, extroverted intuition or exploration now takes on the more holistic role. This is the more diffused, a little bit more receptive part. And then the judging function of introverted feeling or authenticity, the co-pilot or auxiliary, that is the more assertive, sort of focused energy. So it is the exact opposite of the creative type. And so you're going to see a very different style of ENFP. This ENFP is a little bit more wired like the norm, right? And so they're going to reflect that in their behavior. They're more patient. Now, of course, you just have to remember that this is in contrast or in comparison to other styles of ENFP. So add the modifier.
We're still talking about ENFP at the end of the day.
Exactly. But these are the ones that come across as patient, reflective, technically adept, traditional, and well-mannered. But they still are charming, right? They're still ENFPs, so they have a more quiet charm, right? And in Linda Barron's vernacular, this would be a little bit more of a chart the course style, right? They're more technical. They're grounded, right? They don't need somebody to ground them. They do it themselves. They're more linear thinkers than other ENFPs. They usually are strongly visual and they're factual, right? So that vomiting rainbow style, an ENFP that is like that is not going to resonate with those kinds of stereotypes at all. They are from all over the spectrum, basically any career path that makes sense, right? To the more normalizing way of going about things. So they could be engineers or lawyers or, sort of computer programmers or soldiers, right? Anything that is a good working member of society. But they're still ENFPs, so they tend to find themselves in the arts still, right? They still have that interest. And so if they do go that direction, it's going to be more technical. So as opposed to the creative subtype, that if they find themselves in a technical aspect, they're going to bring the art. If they're a normalizing and they find themselves in art, they're going to bring a technical aspect, which I thought was really interesting. It's like that's where they meet in the middle.
Yeah.
They rely on certain brain regions to engage in hypothesizing and imagining, but they don't quite have that same starburst that the creative type does. And so they're still going to be interested in brainstorming, but it won't be as second nature to them as the creative. They're going to be quieter, more structured. They'll have a more critical eye than other ENFPs, so they might be a little bit more calibrative than other styles. They have a tendency to lean really hard on designs, templates, structures, and that sort of thing. And they might even feel nervous if they don't have one, though leaning on them is a learned skill, which I thought was interesting. It's not natural for the ENFP to need a template, but once they discover templates, now they feel uncomfortable without them. So this is a very unique sort of phenomena of the normalizing ENFP. They tend to keep a lid on their enthusiasm more than other ENFPs, so they're not as bombastic. They are less random, but they still have that subtle playfulness. They value working with a team. So the creative subtype of ENFPs, I think, is a little bit more solo, right? They kind of want to work on their own. And then the dominant just wants to be in charge. This normalizing understands the value of teamwork. And so they're going to be less resistant to working with groups of people and in cooperation. And they just really like, traditional things, right? They're a little bit more traditionalist. They enjoy families and family traditions and activities that are more mainstream, but it always comes with a twist.
Yeah.
Right? In the INFJ careers, we talked about the normalizing INFJ. We'll almost always have just a piece of information to let you know that they're not exactly what you expect them to be, right? I talked about the accountant with all those different styles of eyeglass frames.
Yeah.
This ENFP is going to have a similar feel, right? They're going to be more normalizing, but there's something about them that is just a little different from everybody else. So it's the same, but with a twist.
I wrote down quirky hobbies next to this type.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think another big part of it isn't just interesting hobbies on the side, but remembering that ENFPs are deeply passionate, particularly about crusades. And they're not going to lose that necessarily. They're going to keep that idea of wanting to improve things, wanting to make things better, and being very passionate about the things that mean something to them. So they're still going to have a desire to impact others, impact culture. They'll have that deep passion inside of them that wants to move forward and improve and change things up just a little bit. And I thought Dario I thought it was really astute when he said the biggest contribution can be making something a new standard of tradition that the average person can relate to.
Yeah.
So in some ways, it's almost like this type is a bridge, right? It's a bridge between the usual and the very, very different. This style of ENFP sort of meets in the middle and almost acts like a translator for those two worlds.
So I could imagine this style of ENFP is the most likely to mistype as maybe a judger, a censor, somebody that is not very ENFP at all. If they tend to be wired this way, it might, or just expressing this way, it might give a false read on the style of ENFP may not read ENFP in like a typing session or a profiling session, something like that.
Yeah, I actually think this is probably a very common mistype.
Mm-hmm.
I could see the style of ENFP mistyping as an introvert, as a censor, as a thinker, or as a judger.
Yeah.
It's all over the map because we just don't think of this style of ENFP, and yet there they are.
Let's talk about some of the careers that would lend themselves to this style. Now, like you said, the dominant ENFP is most likely going to want to either start something or be at the top of something. They're very comfortable with hierarchy, especially being at the top of the hierarchy and preserving the system, leading the system, quite frankly. The creative is much more likely to need a platform, kind of ancillary to the structures. They want to live in solo land, be creative, be expressive. They need a platform or somebody to support them. This normalizing ENFP, and by the way, the neurotransmitter is serotonin, is the preferred neurotransmitter chemical. This ENFP is more okay with hierarchy, but not necessarily needing to be in charge. Probably very comfortable plugging themselves into an organization, a system, a nonprofit, a business, a corporation, and working a regular job or working a career path in a normal way, working up the career ladder. So with that in mind, let's talk about some of the possible career choices this style might want.
Okay, so these careers, again, they're not comprehensive, but they might give you a little bit of an idea of how a normalizing ENFP or the directions they go. And this is, this is going to reflect the more patient style, the more technically adept element. It will allow them to capitalize on that little more of that organizational skill and team player mindset. But I think it's also, these are places where ENFPs can have that impact of changing the standard.
Yeah.
So I think that's why these ones made the list. They are civil engineer, architect, software developer, financial planner, environmental scientist, technical writer, urban planner, data analyst, industrial designer, nutritionist, operations manager, web developer, mechanical engineer, information systems manager, and speech language pathologist. Right. Which is very interesting because I actually know an ENFP who's a speech language pathologist.
There you go.
Yeah. So I think, again, these are not the kinds of careers that you normally would throw the direction of ENFP. It's not like the actor or the entrepreneur. But you could really see an ENFP heading these directions and making a big impact, right? Yeah. Being able to make changes from within, not just, necessarily altering things from without.
It's important, though, that they do have some kind of a hobby, something that lets them have that intuitive, creative outlet. If you're an ENFP that you are identifying with this normalizing subtype, you also might need some creative, intuitively focused people to have conversation with, brainstorming sessions with. People that you can, outside of work or outside of the career you're in, have your back around unlocking some of that intuition, some of those quirky parts of you, some of the interesting elements of the creativity you bring, it's very needed outside of work, I think.
Well, and what's interesting is that for other types, the normalizing, man, those hobbies were so important. I think actually, interestingly enough, for the normalizing ENFP, it's impact. I think even more so, I agree, they need to have people they can have those brainstorming conversations with. But I think what really lights them up is knowing that they are able to have that impact, that they're actually changing things for the better, that they're altering standards. And so if they're unable to do that in the career, then this ENFP might need to find nonprofit or volunteer, opportunities to have that impact.
Let's talk about the harmonizing ENFP subtype. So this ENFP is the fourth one, and it's got a really interesting attunement of their cognitive functions. So we talk about that driver dominant of extroverted intuition, exploration, how the ENFP learns information, takes and perceives the world, and making decisions with the co-pilot or auxiliary function of introverted feeling or authenticity, making decisions that resonate in the core values. Where are these two functions attuned from, like a type geek or a deeper understanding?
So this is the opposite subtype from the dominant. And of course, the dominant both had that more focused, assertive, analytic bent. So the harmonizing ENFP is the opposite. Both of those functions are more open, receptive, a little bit more diffused, taking in the peripheral, not as high energy, but a little bit more relaxed. And so what makes a harmonizing ENFP is both the preferred functions are holistic functions. And so these ENFPs have a lot of subtle tones. Right? They're not as assertive. They're not as aggressive. They're not as in your face. They're a little bit more sort of chill vibe ENFPs. And they tend to be older and wiser, even if not in age, in affectation. Right? The whole feel about them is just going to have some kind of almost I've seen everything, right? Sort of that vibe. But Daria mentions they offer a dedicated heart, a sophisticated thinking, and a real warmth and caring about them, right? There's like a warmth. They're more flowing, relaxed, and in Linda Barron's vernacular, a behind-the-scenes style of ENFP. They are very complicated in their brain wiring, though. And that's why I say they have almost a I've seen everything feel. You can tell that their brain wiring follows a lot of disparate, complex experiences throughout life. And there's not really one style of brain wiring that suits them, unlike the other three subtypes that are very clear in their brain wiring. The dominant has a very strong prefrontal cortex executive wiring. The creative is very much that starburst pattern. The normalizing has this almost like, sort of organized little streets or rows, interestingly enough, but this is all over the place. They can have diamond-shaped patterns. They can have strong starbursts. They can have a combination of these. They can have a mild starburst and strong diamonds. Like, it's just it's really unique to their life experiences, right?
Yeah.
And so because of that, they have a very quirky way of thinking, even more so than other ENFPs. Very iconoclastic, very specific to them, really peculiar to them, a particular way and style of thinking. And so they tend to, and I think this really shows up in career, their style of thinking gets really sort of fused with whatever it is that they're doing to contribute. So, for example, if they're a therapist, they integrate their natural ENFP talents with all of their career knowledge to work that in a very deep way. So they're bringing in lots of different frames of reference, lots of different styles of thinking, lots of different models to apply to the thing that they're doing for impact. And that's really what lights a harmonizing ENFP up, is that they have something to apply themselves to, something to take all of this learned information and focus it in. A single point that brings all the talents that they've accumulated over many decades to be able to apply everything together in one point.
Yeah.
And that's more of a one-to-one, of course. Harmonizing subtypes are almost always better in a one-to-one environment or setting where they're building a relationship and having an impact on that level. So, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so the neurotransmitter associated with this is estrogen on the chemical side. As you mentioned that, one-to-one situation, that's also, I think, a strategy for success in where, the creative subtype for ENFP might be hunting for a platform like a YouTube channel to create and utilize as a support for their creativity. I think for the harmonizing ENFP, finding a champion, we talk about ENFPs, there's kind of this nickname of champion for ENFPs, but I think an ENFP that's at the harmonizing subtype level, they need a champion. They need a person that can help understand their value and get them connected to the best way they can serve others. And usually it's hard for somebody that's a harmonizing to kind of put themselves forward because they're in such a receptive energy, and to do their best work, they need to be in that receptive energy. So people need to come to them. So that means they need an advocate, a champion, another person that can quote unquote market them or bring them forward or put them on or showcase them, because it's very nuanced what they do. And it's, like you said, it's a very offbeat kind of brain wiring and all of this. So I think the strategy, if you identify with this harmonizing style, I would be looking for people that you can have in your network, a few key people that can help get you the career opportunities, the coaching situations you want to be in, all of the things that light you up. You might need another person to see that in you and then bring that forward to the world.
I would totally agree with that for almost every single harmonizing subtype, except if the ENFP, harmonizing ENFP, came up through marketing. So that they're very, like, every single ENFP is a little different when they go through harmonizing in this way, weirdly enough, because ENFPs otherwise are very homogenous in their brain wiring, usually.
Yeah.
Except for the harmonizing. So if they came up through marketing, they might have that dialed in. So in case there's a harmonizing ENFP out there who's like well into their 60s, they're like, no, I think I know what I'm doing with that. But that would be very particular to them, right?
Yes.
Most of the time, a harmonizing subtype needs somebody else to market them.
That's right.
So just to make a note, a lot of harmonizing subtypes, we've talked about this with other types, is that they aren't as anchored, right? They're almost like specialists that require a very specialized context to be able to do what they do beautifully.
Yeah.
This is a type, this is the harmonizing subtype that is a little bit more specialized in identity. They're very grounded and anchored in their identity and beliefs. I would say probably more so than other harmonizing subtypes. Yeah. So that's the thing that they specialized in, was themselves, effectively.
Oh, and that makes that whole marketing idea even more important. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's hard to market the value of who you are, but if another person can help put you forward or can help support you in that can really be powerful, because, especially this subtype, it's going to be hard for them to toot their own horn, like unless they came to the marketing frame, like you said. Exactly.
If they went through that, which a lot of ENFPs do, then they're okay. But everybody else, yes, they're definitely going to need it, especially since what sets them apart is that high quality of work.
Yeah.
Right. It's almost like this is an earned subtype, if that makes sense. And usually they have a pretty sophisticated understanding of whatever it is that they have become a specialist in. They are good with complex information. They can be incredible transformers, right? It's people who really help others transform or a situation or context. Yeah. They tend to be peaceful. They tend to have a lot of integrity. I mean, not every harmonizing ENFP is going to have earned the badge, so to speak. There might be reasons why somebody became a harmonizing ENFP much younger out of necessity. But the majority of ENFPs are going to grow into this space. It's not going to be something that they just do right out of the blister packaging, so to speak. And so because of that, there's a little bit more integrity that comes along with the age and the seasoning. They ponder a lot. They ask deep philosophical questions. They enjoy discovery through discussion, and they act as advocates for enduring changes. They are quieter. They have smaller groups of friends. They are usually not bombastic. This ENFP might think they're an INFP, right? They might think that they're, or possibly an INFJ. They might very much identify as an introvert, even though they are definitely extroverted.
Empathic, also. I think this is a subtype that would have that deep, empathetic framework. Let's talk about some of the careers this type might choose.
So these are the careers that tap into that dedicated aspect, that more sophisticated way of thinking, the more relaxed and flowing style. Of course, again, it is not a comprehensive list, but what's on here is clinical psychologist, college professor, diplomat, research scientist, environmental consultant, film director, investigative journalist, nonprofit executive director, social worker, art curator, human rights advocate, public policy analyst, marriage and family therapist, cultural anthropologist, and medical ethicist.
They didn't have cult leader on there.
They didn't.
I'm imagining when I'm like 80 years old and a cult leader, I'm like, this is the subtype I think I'll be at that time.
You'll finally have you'll have earned your cult leader ENFP status.
My Osho phase
at
the end of my life. Okay, so those are some of the careers. What are so that we talked about some of the mistypes, the careers for this. Anything else we need to mention about this subtype?
The neurotransmitter is for the harmonizing subtype. The preferred neurotransmitter is estrogen.
Estrogen, that's right. Oh, that's actually what thank you for, we did mention that, but I'm glad you brought it back up because we've only been doing this with a few types, talking about these. And I think ENFP is one that we can probably talk about this too. These neurotransmitters tend to cluster. And we may even do a full podcast on this. I think I mentioned on the INFJ podcast as well for the subtypes. It's interesting that the estrogen and the testosterone, so the dominant and the harmonizing subtypes, are often attracted to each other. They seem to have an attraction. So if you're a dominant subtype, you tend to get along with all of the personality types that are the harmonizing subtype and vice versa. So dominance and harmonizing tend to get along across all types, all 16 types, not just inside of ENFP. But it's interesting that the creative subtypes that are chasing dopamine and the normalizing that are chasing serotonin, they like to just cluster with their own. They don't like to cross lanes. So it's not like a bunch of serotonin normalizing are seeking any of the other types. They just want to stay with more normalizing subtypes across all 16 types. Same thing with the creative dopamine chasers.
Yeah.
So for myself, for example, I find myself as a creative ENFP being attracted to and wanting to hang out with other creative subtypes, no matter what their personality type is at the basis. I want to hang out with creative INTJs and creative ENFJs and creative ENTPs, et cetera. I want to cluster around those, and we're all chasing dopamine together. Well, it ends up kind of being like a bunch of like street performers, though. If you have just a bunch of creative subtypes clustering with no other energies around, you don't really get a lot done. You're really dependent on the platforms you're using, et cetera, et cetera. So I just thought that was an interesting pattern that played out among these subtypes to just kind of understand, okay, who are my friends? Are they all very similar subtype to me? Do I tend to be attracted to other subtypes in my life? And as an ENFP, you can just stick that into your intuition and smoke it and be watching for those patterns in your own life as we go along.
Yeah, and to land the plane on that concept that our careers influence us, I did also want to mention that it's really hard for us, if you imagine this in a quadrant, with dominant at the top left, creative at the top right, normalizing bottom left, and harmonizing bottom right. It's very difficult to cross, like to go diagonally.
Yeah.
And so if you want to pick up characteristics or some of the traits from the other subtypes, it's much easier to go across or down or across and up. So if you identify as maybe a creative ENFP, which is a very common subtype, and you are looking for a little bit more reward in your life. Maybe you've started too many projects and none of them are paying off and you're not getting the proper return on investment. Then you might want to consider taking on roles or assignments that help rewire you to also have access to the dominant subtype, right? Because that type has a tendency to get rewarded a little better. Or if you're a dominant ENFP, and you're looking to stabilize your life a little bit more, maybe you're ready to settle down, then going to the normalizing ENFP place, that might be the thing that you're looking for. Maybe you're raising kids and that's just the season of your life. And it kind of sounds like a lot of roads end up at harmonizing, but if you are a harmonizing person and you would like to have a little bit more oomph, right, a little bit more impact in your environment, like you said, not have to rely so much on other people helping to prop you up, then maybe it's time to go to the creative subtype. So there's a path for a person to be able to develop, enter, or explore all of these subtypes. And your career, your job, the thing you spend 40 plus hours a week doing is one of the best ways to help wire your mind to be able to access all of these character traits because they're all available. Now, the way you do that, for those of you who are type geeks, is to create a more assertive or a more receptive relationship with the cognitive function preference in that quote unquote quadrant or in that subtype. So, for example, if you're a harmonizing ENFP and you want to be a little bit more assertive in a creative way, then you're going to want to pick up a little bit more of that analytic or assertive extroverted intuition quality. Or if you wanted to go more normalizing, then you would rather prefer a more assertive or analytic introverted feeling quality. So that's basically how it works, is you're looking for opportunities to bring those elements out and kind of require you to have a more assertive energy there.
Yeah. And, we talk a lot about personality types through a cognitive function development lens. These are some of the things you can work on when you're developing your cognitive functions, is say, which one do I tend to lean toward, and then rounding out the other side, bringing some of the other elements in. There's activities and things we talk about in all of our programs to help do some of these things and to help grow as a person. I think it's interesting that sometimes people ask, well, can my personality type change over time? I think our view is your core wiring doesn't change. You're born as an ENFP, let's say, but the expression of your type can change over time. In fact, it probably should be changing over time, or maybe there's something wrong. If you are growing and developing as a person and your career is continually shaping you, you're going to see yourself mature through the process of accessing all these different expressions of yourself. And we can't speak enough to how much a career impacts this. Both the career you choose is going to be based on how you prefer to express your ENFP nature, but also it will shape how you show up in the world, how you express based on the career you choose. So you might be a super, super dominant ENFP, but you chose a career that's very, very, harmonizing, let's say. And so over time, I think it will wire you to be way more harmonizing than maybe you started out. Yep. And this could be also a situation where you're like, man, I just don't feel in the career I'm in like this is me. I wish I was doing something different. And you're looking at other ENFPs in your life, maybe that you know or you've seen. You're like, I wish I could do what they're doing. They're probably leaning into other energies in themselves. And maybe the career they chose wired them that way. And so if you want to change, you can actually choose a career that will put you on the path to wire yourself this way, to start to express this outwardly. And I think that could be a great technique. It's one of the best tools, is choose a career that puts you in the place you want to be. So I wanted to mention that. And I think that's everything. We covered it all, right?
Yeah, I think we covered most of what we want to cover.
Good. So if you're an ENFP listening right now, we want to hear from you. What's coming up? Which one of these 4 subtypes do you identify with right now, by the way? What's been your journey? Have you started off with one and you've seen your career path take you in a different direction, has wired you a different way, expressing differently? Are you having struggle, identifying which one you are? Maybe it's different contexts. I think in different contexts, I show up differently as an ENFP. When I'm running a live event or a program, I'm much more dominant than I am when I'm working creatively. I'm much more on the creative side. So how does this show up for you in your life? Come over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this episode, leave a comment, ask a question. More importantly, share your story. Stories are amazing because they're compressed experiences that you can share with us and other people in the Personality Hacker community. We can read your story. We can understand where you're coming from, who you are, the journey you've been on, and other people can learn from that and contribute to you, make comments, and we can get a conversation going around you as an ENFP. So come over and make your voice heard at personalityhacker.com.
Ooh, get a conversation around me as an ENFP. Sounds fun to ENFPs, I'm sure.
It sounds fun to me. I'd love it.
Also, we'll make sure that we have a link to Dr. Dario Nardi's materials on this content.
Yep.
So we tip our hat every time to Dario because this is the work that is the bedrock. His is the bedrock work of this content. And seeing things in this way is actually really sort of changed my perspective about type a little bit. It's been a game changer. So we'll make sure to drop a link for Dario's materials that he's written so far. It hasn't been a whole book at this time, but there is some pretty good information out there. And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave us a rating and review on iTunes, it helps us out a lot. It helps me out a lot. I like reading them, so please do so. We are also on YouTube. You might be watching us right now on our video podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, you can hit like. You can also subscribe for future episodes, and you can hit the bell that lets you know when a new episode comes out. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it at all major book retailers. And if you leave us a rating and a review on Amazon or on Goodreads, That also helps us out a lot. And finally, if we just shook your world up and you went, wait, what? Am I an ENFP? I don't even know anymore. You can head over to personalityhacker.com and take our free online assessment that gives you a little bit more information. It might not be the final definitive piece of information, or maybe you haven't even taken one ever. It gets you going on your journey, or it might be one of the lily pads in the middle of the journey, or it might be the thing that finally nails your type down. I don't know. Come over to personalityhacker.com, take the free online assessment, and see if it feels like your best fit type.
Yeah, and if you are an ENFP, I'd like to mention our ENFP Owner's Manual. It's not an owner's manual you buy off the shelf and own. It helps you create an owner's manual for your life based on how you're wired. We talk about stuff like subtypes. We talk about how to grow all those cognitive functions, talk about career, relationships, but really tuning into the you are here dot on the map of your life. Where do you want to go to as an ENFP? Well, it's really good to understand how you're wired, how you show up, who you are as a person. Knowing that gives you so much leverage for the journey ahead. So come over and get one of those ENFP owner's manuals and start that journey today through the lens of personality type. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.